There are many heroes and antagonists in the history of environmental policy in America, and one such character emerged in the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. In his first 2 years in office, Reagan slashed funding for fundamental federal tools such as the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and the Council of Environmental Quality. From the beginning of his first term in January 1981, Reagan purposely set out to undermine the federal government's capacity to enforce American environmental laws. So which environmentalist, journalist, or activist would rise up to battle this foe? Surprisingly, the champion that would emerge in the 1980s was not a person, but rather statistics, or more specifically, the public opinion poll. While other methods proved ineffective, such as international pressure and the lobbying of NGOs, public opinion polls would prove invaluable at the task of prodding the White House to respond to the environmental cause. The Republican platform for the 1980 presidential elections did not give any indication of Reagan's negative views on environmental policy. Though the Republicans' overarching goal was for an improved economy through a decrease in federal regulation, in regard to the environment, the platform put forth a moderate stance, acknowledging that, quote, a healthy environment is essential to the present and future well-being of Americans, though environmental laws should be reviewed to justify their costs, end quote. In reality, Reagan viewed environmental policy as an obstacle to his plans for economic recovery, and once in office, he strategically attacked American environmental policy on two fronts. The first is through large budget cuts. The EPA's research and development funds were cut in half, essentially crippling the EPA's ability to create more policy suggestions. No one was going to approve environmental action without extensive scientific research. The Council on Environmental Quality also had their budget cut from $2.5 million before Reagan to $700,000 after, and its staff reduced from 50 people to merely 12. Secondly, Reagan sidestepped the long process of refuting existing environmental quality controls by controlling the bureaucracy. He appointed like-minded individuals to positions of power in institutions that maintained environmental policy. Ann Buford was given the post of administrator of the EPA, and James G. Watt was appointed to the position of Secretary of the Interior. Both worked to weaken the enforcement of federal laws from inside of these institutions. By the beginning of 1983, the combination of budget cuts and purposefully shoddy leadership in federal environmental agencies created a bleak image of the future of American environmental policy. Reagan's anti-environmental stance was by no means a secret, and it caused friction internationally and at home. On his first visit to Canada, Reagan was greeted by shouting protesters who were angry about America's lack of action on the issue of acid rain. Reagan's stance also galvanized the lobbying activities of NGOs back home, sparked rapid increases in membership in environmental and conservation organizations, such as the Sierra Club, and was even the driving force behind a Christian environmental movement in the States. However, these opponents to Reagan's stance on the environment were ineffective in changing the president's views and actions. Reagan viewed the environmental NGOs as primarily fringe groups, whose views could only be considered if there was enough public support, and he basically ignored the Canadian frustration over American smokestacks being responsible for over 50% of the acid rain that falls in Canada. Reagan was not responding to any of these political pressures. Surprisingly, the opponent that was the most effective against Reagan's crusade was the public opinion poll. By the 1980s, polls had become integral to American democracy. They offered a gauge of public sentiment without expensive and exhaustive referendums. Also, public opinion polls were generally respected because of their scientific basis in statistics, because of their democratic sampling process, and the simplicity with which polls conveyed information. Reagan even had his own personal team of pollsters gathering public opinion data. Though Reagan was surrounded by public opinion data at the beginning of his term, he largely ignored public sentiment in regards to the environment. While Reagan shot forward with his anti-regulatory and anti-environmental actions, the results of the public opinion polls had consistently reflected that the majority of Americans were supportive of policies such as the Clean Air Act, policies which Reagan was attempting to weaken. One example is the 1981 national poll, where 67% of the sample believed that the government should maintain the present environmental laws, even at the cost of economic growth. Reagan largely ignored the fact that all polls, both conducted by the media and those conducted by his private pollsters, indicated that Americans were supportive of strong environmental standards despite the cost. Congressmen did not ignore these polls. Congressmen, even Republican congressmen, took a stance opposing the president based on their evaluation of polling data, either because of their ideals of American democracy or because of their desire to keep their voters happy. In this way, public opinion polls were influential in holding off Reagan's attack. But Reagan would be swayed by the polling data eventually. The turning point came with the embarrassing EPA scandal in 1983 involving Ann Buford, which resulted in public opinion polls framing questions that made value judgments on Reagan's environmental stance. Reagan could not ignore these polls. In 1983, Ann Buford sparked controversy. She was slapped with a contempt citation for striking deals with polluters rather than forcing them to pay for their share of hazardous waste cleanup. National media began declaring that Reagan prefers to protect polluters, citing polls which indicated that more than half of Americans believe that Reagan cares more about protecting industry than enforcing anti-pollution laws. Polls showed that Americans were pointing their fingers at Reagan, accusing him of being a leader who did not have the people's best interests at heart. In an attempt to appease the American people, Reagan held well-publicized meetings with heads of environmental groups, and James G. Watt, whose actions were similar to Buford's, resigned in December 1983. William D. Ruckelshaus, the first administrator of the EPA, was brought back by Reagan as a show of good faith to the voters. During Reagan's 1984 election campaign, now that it was clear that voters took the health of the environment as a serious concern, he scrambled to reverse his image as an enemy of environmental protection. Reagan even went on a speaking tour to address his stance on the environment in July 1984. Scholars argue that public opinion polls are not good representations of public opinion because though the polls indicated there was a strong support for stronger environmental policies, Reagan was re-elected for a second term. Though this does indicate that other issues may have precedence over the environmental cause despite the high rates of environmental supporters in the polls, it does not diminish the fact that environmental protection had, by 1983, become a broad concern for American society. Public opinion polls were crucial in curbing Reagan's destructive actions towards the federal government's environmental agencies through both political shame and in motivating congressional opposition to Reagan's deregulatory stance.